Well, good evening. My name's Graham Allison. I'm the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and I'm glad to welcome you tonight to the forum, and especially to welcome our special guest, Bill Joy. Bill is chief scientist of Sun Microsystems and a co-founder of the company. He's written a piece that's created a lot of debate in the current issue of Wired, in which he projects potential developments in 3 or 4 major technologies, beginning with information technology running at the rate of Moore's Law, sees a convergence among these and worries about potential consequences even for man's continued existence. We've been debating that in various circles here today, and he'll provide an overview of that argument, and it'll be open for discussion. But just in case this seems or may appear, at least to some of you here who don't know much about Bill Joy, to be another iteration of a Luddite argument, let me remind you that Bill was principal designer of the Berkeley Unix system back in the 1970s, which became the standard in education and research, and which led the way to the open source movement, which has continued apace, particularly in Sun. He joined Sun in 1982, where since then he's led their strategy for an open systems philosophy. He designed Sun's network file system, was a co-designer of the SPARC microprocessor architecture, did the basic pipeline design of UltraSPARC, most recently Java and Genie, distributing computing technology for network computers, are developments that he's led. So this is a person who comes from the middle of this revolution and understands it intimately. In 1997, Bill was appointed by President Clinton as co-chair of the Presidential Information Technology Advisory Committee, which has been providing guidance and advice on areas of high-performance computing, communication, and information technologies. His current research is investigating new uses of distributed computing, enabling using Java and Genie, new methods of human-computer interaction, new microprocessors and systems architectures, and uses in computing of scientific advances in various sciences, particularly as they relate to complex adaptive systems. For our local purposes here at the Kennedy School and Harvard, the great opportunity to hear from somebody from the midst of the revolution who's paused for a moment to ask, where is all this leading, and what does it portend, and what might the consequences be, and what policy implications might that have for government and governance, is a great opportunity. So please join me in welcoming Bill Joy.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. In an earlier time, Albert Einstein said that the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift towards unparalleled catastrophes. Fortunately, at least so far, most of those catastrophes haven't happened, but I'd like to talk to you about similar dangers, which I think today are as real as the dangers that were seen by Einstein and others in the 50s. I'm fundamentally an optimist about science and technology. Science and technology have been an enormous boon to mankind. We wouldn't have as many people on the planet if we didn't have agricultural technology. Our lifespans have been greatly extended. And then some of the new technologies of the 21st century are going to bring huge benefits, almost unimaginable wealth, curing diseases, potentially ending material poverty, with robotics potentially ending the need for physical labor. Genetics, nanotech, and robotics, what I call GNR, have these potential enormous benefits. And it's very likely that we'll have tens of thousands of companies, new .geno, .nano, and .robo startups like we have .coms, generating multiple trillions of dollars of wealth. And it's all enabled really by Moore's law, which is the underlying exponential driver in information technology, where computers are getting to be a multiple, a very high interest rate. Every 18 months, things get about twice as good. It used to be the case even last year where people like Intel, who were the leader in providing chips that are on the Moore's law curve, said this was going to run out very soon. But I think with some new technologies, particular nanoelectronics, we can see now that this curve is likely to extend out to about 2030, which means that the computers in 2030, inexpensive computers, could be 1,000,000 times faster than the personal computers that we have today. And I know that may seem like an enormous number. 25 years ago, I did work on a supercomputer, which was about 100,000 times worse price performance than the computers we have today. A Cray 1 was a $10 million or $20 million machine with an 80 megahertz clock rate. And just do the ratio to a gigahertz for a couple $1,000s, and you'll see the improvement over the last 25 years. The new news is this is likely to continue for 30 years, and most people didn't believe that last year. A factor of 1,000,000 is an enormous number. A factor of 1,000,000 reduces a millennium to 8 hours. A calculation which on a machine today would take you 1,000 years to do. You could ask a what if, go to sleep, wake up, and you'd have the answer. That is just lets you ask questions and receive answers that were inconceivable. A lifetime turns into 30 minutes. A year turns into 30 seconds. So I'm optimistic. Let me say it again. I'm optimistic because I'm not going to talk about the optimism very much anymore, because you can see that in everything around you. You can see all the manifest wonders, the NASDAQ index, whatever. By whatever measure you want to imagine the wonders of the future, enormous investment is going into these technologies. If there wasn't the enormous investment because of the enormous potential, there wouldn't be the dangers. Now, our culture is really rooted in the Greeks. We've been running an experiment with democracy and the kind of civilization we have, I think, largely since about the 5th century BCE. But there have been interruptions like the Dark Ages, who kind of restarted in the Renaissance and really got an accelerating improvement in the material sense when science and technology took hold. It's been a very successful way of exploring the world. The Greeks were both objective about the world, which I think was the reason for their success, but they were also spiritual. Edith Hamilton said in the Greek way, the Greeks weren't tempted to evade facts. It is we ourselves who are sentimentalists, we to whom poetry, all art, is only a superficial decoration of life. The Greeks looked straight at it. They were completely unsentimental. It was a Roman who said it was sweet to die for one's country. The Greeks never said it was sweet to die for anything. They had no vital lies. And I think to be worthy of this tradition that we're the inheritors of that goes back so far, we can't lie to ourselves either in a situation where I think there's great opportunity but also great danger. It's dangerous to romanticize things about these new technologies. And so what I would like to do to you this evening is speak to you in a very honest, kind of blunt way, the kind of blunt speaking about these things that you'd see if you go to the Greek tragedies, for example, people speaking about their condition and what situation they face, and what might even at points be viewed as an unpleasant way. But I think we owe it to the people who came before us to speak about the things honestly. In the 20th century, we dealt with some very difficult problems. We had nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons threats, the weapons of mass destruction. These were largely developed by the military. They had largely military applications. There's not a lot of peaceful uses of a fusion warhead. They required large-scale activities to develop, often required rare raw materials, and the knowledge to create them was not widely available. And they were largely held by a small number of states, largely the US and the Soviet Union, to the extent that there was the ability to, say, destroy civilization. We're currently facing a threat where these technologies and these weapons are becoming more multipolar. The president recently made a visit to India and Pakistan to try to, talk down the threat in that region. And we have this loose nuke threat that's facing us now. A physicist once said that, it would almost have been better if nuclear fission didn't work. I mean, it's actually close in the constants in physics, whether the chain reaction continues. And someone I'd like to know who said nuclear fission is a fit technology for a wise, far-seeing, and incorruptible people. In other words, it's really not a good thing to have around. And I don't think we're wise, far-seeing, or incorruptible. So we would have probably been better off if fission just hadn't worked. These 21st century technologies, genetic engineering, nanotech, and robotics, are equally powerful, or in fact more powerful, I think, than these 20th century ones. But they have some other characteristics which make them more troubling. First of all, they're being developed by the commercial sector, which tends to be more efficient and more distributed in terms of finding any way of controlling them. They have both military and commercial uses. Obviously, the commercial uses are dominant. They have huge commercial value. They can be developed often by small-scale, even personal activities. They don't tend to require rare raw materials. And the knowledge to do these things is becoming very widespread. So what I saw and what led me to write the Wired piece is the recognition that in the information age, and we are in an information age, and we don't fully understand the information age yet, but knowledge itself has become a weapon. For example, the person who took down the net today with the I Love You virus what they used is they used knowledge to create that. They didn't need rare raw materials, and they used the network to propagate it. Obviously, it didn't do damage in the physical world, it did damage in the virtual world, but it's of the same character as these other technologies have the potential for doing damage in the physical world. And this, what I call KMDs, or knowledge-enabled mass destruction, is much more likely to be available to individuals in small groups. Now, the thing that makes it especially dangerous is these new technologies, genetic engineering, nanotech, and robotics, have an additional characteristic, which is what I call self-replication, which is if you have a bomb, you can blow it up once, but if I release something into the environment that makes more copies of itself, a single act can cause almost unbounded harm. I'm sitting in the bar an hour ago watching on the headline news of the closed captioning at the Charles Hotel. 80% of the computers in Sweden are affected by what somebody released in the Philippines a few hours before. And granted, that occurred in the virtual world, but we also have jet planes that move things around in the physical world. So the dangers, some of these new vectors for replication should be very concerning. So the fact that genetic and nanotech and robotics are both information-based and have the ability to contain their own ability to replicate allows a single act with one of these kinds of technologies to cause extreme harm. And by 2030 then, if we can build machines that are 1 million times as powerful as the personal computers of today, and that enormous power can be combined with the kind of understanding we're developing in the physical sciences and the new kind of deep understanding in genetics, enormous transformative power is released into the hands of individuals and small groups. And it opens up the opportunity to completely redesign the world to achieve the control over nature that Francis Bacon's wet dream, essentially, if you will, that we've all probably read the quote at one point or another. But what's happened is the replicating and evolving processes that have traditionally been confined to the natural world really become domains of human endeavor, really in a wide scale for the first time. So the danger we face fundamentally comes down to the fact that the democratization, because of the nature of information technology and the nature of knowledge, of access to things which can self-replicate and cause extreme harm is a very dangerous and powerful combination. The risk of harm, I think, is potentially extremely great. We're accustomed to living with kind of routine scientific breakthroughs. I don't think we've come to terms with the fact that these technologies pose a very different kind of threat than the ones that have come before because of the nature of uncontrolled self-replication that could damage the physical world and these newer technologies in the same way this virus today is damaging the virtual world. And my belief is that we run the risk of what I would call in the article a further perfection of extreme evil, which is to use some Hannah Arendt language, originally talking about the Nazis, but basically the nation states in the 20th century had the power to do what you'd call extreme or banal evil acts. But if we are not careful, we'll empower individuals through accident or malicious design or even small groups to become empowered to these kinds of things which have historically been limited to only, in fact, a couple nation states really had us and the former Soviet Union had the ability to destroy civilization. Now, in genetic engineering is probably the nearest term risk. I think people in the field would say probably within the next 20 years we can imagine developing designer pathogens. I would observe that our experience with disease in the natural world is misleading in terms of the danger of, say, genetically engineered diseases. There's a rough rule of thumb. If a disease is successful and has survived and we've come to some sort of rough balance with it, it's not going to generally kill all of us. it becomes relatively less virulent because it's not really necessary. In fact, if a disease was so deadly that it killed us all, we wouldn't be here, and neither would it. So, I mean, that's a sort of retrospective Darwinian view that because we're here, those diseases aren't here. But lab work evades Darwin. Something I construct new in the lab doesn't have to obey those rules. It could co-extinct its target. Potentially when you design things in the lab, you can adjust virulence, contagion, and incubation period in a way that creates whatever effect that you want and probably work around natural immunity, because the immune system does have bugs in it. The danger we face is that all the information people need to do this may be public. That's currently the course that we're on. The equipment's getting cheaper. The computers are almost infinitely powerful for exploring the designs. And in some sense, given a gene sequence, good versus bad is just a question of what environment it's being used. And it may be very, very difficult to tell, even if you're manufacturing things as a contract for somebody, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's kind of, as bad as plastic handguns or something. You can't really, there's no equivalent of a metal detector. Just look at a sequence and a priori tell if it's dangerous or not. Nanotechnology is really, if biotechnology is using information designing with organic materials, you could think of nanotech as just designing at the same scale, at the atomic scale, anything that you can build that isn't necessarily living, it's just inorganic. And in fact, genetic engineered things and nanotech are really in a spectrum. You could add some genetic engineering on top of a bioweapon, or you could add some nanotech to a living cell. You don't have to go pure nano or pure genetic. These things exist in the continuum from natural diseases to emerging diseases to bioweapons to genetic to nano. And one person's natural disease is somebody else's emerging disease. In some sense, take, for example, the Black Death in 14th century Europe. According to the Britannica, it was transmitted to Europeans when a Kipchak army besieging a Genoese trading post in the Crimea catapulted plague-infested corpses into the town, and subsequently a third of the population of Europe died. Now, conceivably, a third of the Kipchak army had already died, so the people who were left were not as susceptible. And then the more recent example in this hemisphere, in the 16th century Americas, smallpox was brought over by the Europeans, for whom it wasn't an emerging disease, but it hadn't been seen in the New World. It had emerged apparently in the Old World since they got separated. And in the book Stolen Continents, Robert Wright writes, the turning point, as so often the contest for America came with the plague. The scourge was no longer left in the hands of God. Lord Jeffrey Amherst secured his place in history as the inventor of modern germ warfare with this notorious command: infect the Indians with sheets upon which smallpox patients have been lying, or by any other means which may serve to exterminate this accursed race. But of course, if you see the previous quote about the plague indicates that people's use of this as this kind of warfare dates farther back. The most recent, I actually think these kinds of plagues and pestilences have fallen out of our common experience. I think that's very dangerous. The last one that occurred in a very, very fast, widespread way was really the influenza pandemic of 1918. Certainly the AIDS epidemic has affected people, but it didn't burn into the consciousness the way one of these things does when it happens so incredibly fast. In fact, the recent antibiotics and sanitation improvements that we may have temporarily at least checked some of the microbes, but as is well documented now, in fact, a lot of the side effect of treating AIDS patients, things like multi-disease resistant tuberculosis, are rearing their ugly head. So I think we've lost track of what a plague is like. So I'm afraid I'd like to remind you what a plague is like. I'd actually like to read from the Roman Lucretius from the last chapter of his book, The Way Things Are. A plague once visited Athens. At first they felt their heads burning with fever, throats blackened, sweating blood. The tongue filled up, engorged with blood, and became too hard to move. Men's inner parts were burning to their very bones. Their guts were furnaces. The only thing they had to drink was thirst, which made a deluge seem less than a raindrop. Doctors shook their heads while patients stared blankly. The signs of death were obvious. The mind was crazed with grief and fear. 8 days or 9 would find the limbs grow stiff in death. There seemed to be no certain remedy. What gave life to one killed others. The plague was most infectious. It could spread as pestilences do with animals, cattle, and sheep, so death was piled on death. None were left sometimes as mourners when the dead were hurried to their graves. Battles broke out as the survivors fought for funeral pyres with corpses heaped on corpses. Funeral rites, which these pious people held in all traditional reverence, became quite out of fashion. Everyone in grief buried his own, whatever way he could, amidst a general panic. Sudden need and poverty persuaded men to use horrible makeshifts. Howling, They would place their dead on pyres prepared for other men, apply the torches, maim and bleed and brawl to keep the corpses from abandonment. Okay, well, let's change the subject. Robotics. Robotics is a really different kind of a threat. I mean, these threats I've been talking about in the continuum from natural disease to nanotech really are the form of pathogens of different form. The threat with robotics is that if we invent a species that's superior to ourselves and more intelligent, and that can evolve, and that is really out of our control, you know, why would it treat us any better than we treat the other animals? Also, first to notice, I think that nanoelectronics is widely estimated in the next 30 years to give us power of roughly the order of the brain, and there's no reason to believe that the Moore's law of progress will stop then. I don't know what the next technology is, but other people, there's certainly speculation. Some people have suggested that we'll just become robots. That wouldn't save us from any of these other problems, because robots could attack each other with technology in the same way that we can become subject to that. But I would make 3 observations about robots that would suggest to you that a robot culture would be inhuman in no sense. First of all, robots are likely to be asexual. Robot reproduction is likely to be what we call Lamarckian, which is that while we pass our culture through artifacts, they could directly pass experience to their offspring, which is what Lamarck thought happened, which is why he got his name. But also, it's not even clear that they would have the notion of an individual. I mean, you see this in Star Trek with the Hive, but it is the collective consciousness of all the robots. It may not be individual. So something that's asexual, Lamarckian, and potentially not individual bears very, very little relationship to humans. And to call them something like mind children, as Hans Moravec had in his book, I think is to use language in a very deceitful way. It's not justified by even a cursory examination of the facts. So this would really be a change to the evolutionary paradigm. If we put evolution on this technology track, the technology track evolving 1,000,000 times as fast as the biological track. We've had, the biological evolution largely stopped when we came along. The evolution has mostly been cultural. And the cultural evolution, to go onto the technology track, is yet another accelerator. It's also the case that this is such an earth-shattering event, it could easily truncate the evolutionary tree. The evolutionary tree just doesn't grow arbitrarily. Occasionally it gets truncated, and as you know, Burgess shale and all that. So it could collapse back, in a sense, if we brought the robots about in some sort of conflict between us and them, so that neither of us were on the main trunk. And you know, the intelligent life of the far future could be derived from neither us nor the robots. So we ought to be very, very careful before we create autonomous things that are potentially smarter than ourselves and let them loose in the world. The more real danger in the short run, I think, is extremists or delusional people. Writing in response to my Wired article, a neurobiologist at the University of Washington in the Seattle Times said, "There's a class of people with delusional disorder who can remain employed and pretty functional for decades, even if they're only 1% of the population." That's 20,000 mostly untreated delusional people in the Puget Sound area. Even if only 1% of these has the intelligence or education to intentionally create sustained or widespread harm, it's still a pool of 200 high-performing sociopathic or delusional techies just in the Puget Sound area alone. And you scale it up to the world. Think of those as 200 Kaczynskis. And the question is, how much opportunity can you give them to cause harm before something happens? Another way you can think of this is like Egypt Air Flight 990. Clearly there were 2 pilots, and one of them, or 3 pilots, one of them left the cockpit and the other guy crashed the plane. How many people would have to be on a plane with a crash button before you'd refuse to get on? If everyone who's a passenger with you could crash the plane, I wouldn't get on the plane with very many people at all. But if you think of the planet as being like a plane and you give everybody a button, that's not a scenario which makes a whole lot of sense. It's really, and if you think about the ancient world, it's a return of fate, because our continued existence is a function of random acts by other people that are unexplainable. That's a rough definition of fate. I think this path clearly leads to insanity. It's a widespread enabling of the people to do genocide or cause extinction, or even worse. There's probably even worse things short of these things which are like a lingering, horrible state that you can get into. People have proposed some technical fixes. Carl Sagan thought, he saw these problems very clearly. He said, we have to go to the stars. In the long run, that's the only way to ensure the survival of the species. The problem right now is there's not enough time. These dangers are too near term. We don't have time to get very many people off the planet. And in any case, with the ethical responsibility for the people who are left behind, it remains. So that doesn't really address the issue. Ray Kurzweil's book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, kind of has an optimistic view that we're going to become one with the technology. But I would argue even if we became robots, and we were happy doing that, and individual liberty and all that got addressed in the whole process, it doesn't really shield us from the threats, because robots would have their own kind of psychoses. And I find it not, I think our humanity is lost in the process, so I'm not sure that's an acceptable solution. The other technical fix that people proposed is shields. For example, so if we're going to shield ourselves against people doing pathogens, we're going to just have a perfect human immune system. Well, I somehow don't think we're going to come up with a perfect immune system in the time frame of interest, given that we don't even have a cure for a single viral disease at this point. To protect against nanotechnology, all we have to do is deploy a Doomsday nanoshield. The problem with these shields is they can have autoimmune response. If you amp up the human immune system, I have people in my family with autoimmune disease. I can't imagine what would happen. Give me a broad antiviral or antibacterial, kill all the bacteria and viruses that are naturally in my body, and then I get opportunistic infections like you see in AIDS patients. So that doesn't really work. You can't just be a blunt instrument here. In the case of robots, people propose something like Asimov's laws. But the problem is, if robots are subject to mutation, they could mutate away from the controls that we've given them. So shields have lots of problems. Talking about the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was in the 20th century an attempt to build a shield for nuclear, Luis Alvarez, the Nobel laureate in physics, summarized it very nicely. He said, bright guys, no common sense. Arthur C. Clarke said, a total defense might indeed be possible in a century or so, but the technology involved would produce, as a byproduct, weapons so terrible that no one would bother with anything as primitive as ballistic missiles. In other words, it's often the case, if you really look at these technologies, you discover that more technology doesn't solve the problem that the technology creates. We could hope for some non-technical fixes. Perhaps our better opportunity to address these things is there. You could have a faith-based solution and say hope for a second or first coming. But if you actually go and if you go and talk to people of faith, that's not what the Bible says. That's not what the different religions. The return of the Messiah or anything of that nature is not related to us being about to destroy ourselves. The faith would say that part of the ark, the Noah thing, and the whole story was it gave us personal responsibility, including essentially the right to destroy ourselves. So you don't find, in the ethical system of the faith, I don't think you find that as an answer. I suppose you're an atheist, you could hope that aliens will come to save us, but that seems like a foolish solution to this problem. The only solution that appears realistic is to just find ways to reduce the danger. We can not develop some of the technologies. For example, we didn't develop offensive biological weapons, which I think was an insensible thing to do. Even if the other side is developing them, having them in the world is a worse thing. So I think we have to do something. I wrote an editorial in the op-ed in the Washington Post, which suggested that we could do some things that we considered with the weapons of mass destruction threats. But we have to realize what the level of the danger is and understand how strong our response would be. The philosopher John Leslie has estimated the risk of extinction to be around 30% due to these and some other risks. But much more if you believe something called the Doomsday argument. The Doomsday argument says, well, we're here, and we could be in space very soon, but we're not. But if we're eventually going to be in space and colonize the galaxy, then most humans would have been born after that occurred. So this kind of makes me concerned, because the odds of me being born here it seems unlikely to be born now, unless this is the last generation, which is then it's the most likely one. Now, not everybody buys this, and if you want, you can go to xxx.lanel.gov and the quantum physics, and people are writing papers because there's some philosophical, like all cretins are liars and a cretin says it, and these kinds of paradoxical situations. But it's not proven or disproven, and if it's true, it raises the risk substantially. Ray Kurzweil in his book says the risk is probably 50-50. Saying we have probably a better than even chance of making it through, but he says, but I've always been accused of being an optimist. So in either case, any double-digit percentage of this seems to me something that we should be concerned about. And these numbers are far beyond completely unacceptable risk. And these evaluation of risks don't include outcomes short of extinction, which leave us in some horrible, degraded state like you see in funny science fiction movies. So it seems to me we have an ethical problem. The ethical problem is these technologies are so powerful that if we release them into the world unchecked, which is what capitalism is in a sense doing, we're enabling genocide or extinction on a wide scale. Genocide is a crime of the highest order. It's a crime without borders in the absence of war. It's more than a war crime. We don't have any way of enforcing it in general right now. But as scientists and technologists and business leaders, I don't think we can afford to be complicit in genocide. We've got to put in some safeguards or limit development in some way. And it has to account for the reality, on-the-ground reality of extremists and the fact that people make mistakes and that they're crazy individuals. I think we also have to move beyond a fatalistic notion that whatever science finds is fine and it doesn't really matter. Oppenheimer said in November '45, shortly after the bombing of Hiroshima, "It's not possible to be a scientist unless you believe that the knowledge of the world and the power which this gives is a thing which is of intrinsic value to humanity and that you're using it to help in the spread of knowledge and are willing to take the consequences." I'm afraid I have to say he's wrong in this time frame for the situation we face now. Taking no responsibility for consequences, I think, is beyond irresponsible. The existence of what I'm calling KMDs, which have a very different flavor, forces us to re-examine this attitude. I agree that knowledge is good and the search for truths is good, and we've long agreed, and it's the bedrock of our society, really, that open access to information is the basis of a democratic society. We recognize the problems of the attempts to restrict access to and development of knowledge. Societies where that has been done have largely been the totalitarian societies. And in recent times, we particularly have revered scientific knowledge. But despite all this, if open access to and unlimited development of knowledge and this technology puts us all in clear danger of extinction, then common sense really demands that we re-examine even these beliefs, which are really bedrock beliefs for us. I don't think truth can be the highest goal. Nietzsche warned us at the end of the 19th century not only that God is dead, but that, quote, "faith in science, which after all exists undeniably, cannot owe its origin to a calculus of utility. It must have originated in spite of the fact that the disutility and dangerousness of the will to truth, or truth at any price, is proved to it constantly." And we don't have to even go to Nietzsche to find the danger of the will to truth. Look in Oedipus. And that's really, the Oedipus story is really not about sleeping with your mother. It's about the danger of seeking truth at all costs. And I think the truth that science is seeking here can certainly be considered a dangerous substitute for God if it leads to our extinction. Now, the search for truth then, even if it's an absolutely just law, has to admit exceptions. The Romans had a notion that extreme legal justice is often extreme injustice. It's very short in Latin, it's only 4 words. But the point is that an absolute law applied without exception is injustice. So even if this is an absolute law that we should always seek truth, if we simply apply that as a blunt instrument, we're likely to get ourselves in enormous trouble. Aristotle said that in his ethics book that clearly the final goal of things is not truth, but it's happiness. Truth can only be in service of happiness. Money can only be in service of happiness. Quoting him directly, "We call final without qualification that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. Now such a thing happiness above all else is held to be. For this we choose always for itself and never for the sake of something else." And somehow we've lost that. We've made truth itself into a god, and I think it's at our peril, as Nietzsche predicted would happen. The Dalai Lama, in his recent book, Ethics for a New Millennium, tries to talk about a secular ethic. He said we need to develop a secular ethic to deal with some of these problems. We have to understand what makes people happy. Sounds like Aristotle now. And he argues that there's strong evidence that material progress and the pursuit of knowledge alone do not yield human happiness. So we've got to disconnect if we're going to simply try to run that program forward and assume that we're going to have a desirable outcome. I think both the East and the West have recognized these limits. So what do we have to do now? We clearly need to do something. I think we need to get more discussion going in appropriate forums now that this problem has been recognized. And we have to study both the technical and ethical issues, because I don't think we're going to find the answer to the scientific problem in science itself. In my editorial in the Washington Post, I said we should think about heeding Hans Bethe's call to cease and desist developing weapons of mass destruction, and also these kind of knowledge-based weapons of mass destruction. And we should encourage further development of an ethical culture within science by having scientists take something like a Hippocratic oath. And I guess the technologists and the managers ought to take that as well, that at first do no harm, and providing an environment where people who blow the whistle when harm is being done with some financial safety net so that it's possible for people to be whistleblowers. We need to look at things that were proposed and attempted in the 20th century for weapons of mass destruction, like the internationalization of some of the nuclear technologies that was proposed in the Acheson-Lilienthal report and the Baruch plan at the dawn of the atomic age. We look at the experience of biological weapons development, the fortunate lack of use of biological weapons, and some of the work that's been done on those kinds of treaties. But we also need to develop new mechanisms, because these technologies have enormous commercial use and in fact exist in cyberspace. I mean, basically, there's a strong sense in which an information age and the First Amendment come into conflict. If everything is information, and all information is speech, and speech is free, then you can't regulate anything. So there's a deep conflict between the First Amendment and civil society in an information age that we have not come to grips with. You see in the joke of people saying, well, this T-shirt is a munition because here's a crypto code printed in C code on the T-shirt or something. In the end, I think our ability to deal with these problems is going to depend on our view. Someone sent me a book written by a philosopher named Skolimowski, who said that we ought to think of the Earth not as a Darwinian struggle and ourselves as a bunch of information, but the Earth is kind of a sanctuary for us. We're not going to have another place to be for probably a very long time in any realistic fashion. And I think as a sanctuary, we have to think about how dangerous things are we going to bring into our sanctuary. We don't put oil slicks and poisonous chemicals in the zoo. Why do we bring these incredibly dangerous things into our, and if we think of the world in that way, maybe it helps us understand, maybe we should do nanotech on the moon, you know? Maybe it's even too dangerous to do on the moon. You know, we gotta find ways of thinking about the world in the right way. And if we do that and we engage the bright minds that we have to work on these problems, I'm actually very hopeful. We haven't crossed the threshold of irreversible release of these technologies, in my opinion, yet. But we don't have an unbounded amount of time. Moore's law is moving us forward very, very quickly. The 20th century was clearly a century of war. It was very bloody. The percentage of civilian casualties on a steady rise all through the century. We fortunately avoided nuclear disaster. We did create the ability for the nation states to destroy civilization. My guess would be, if we're not careful, the 21st century may be a century of pestilences, much more like the 14th or 16th century than the 20th. And we've got to change our ways to avoid such disasters, and at all cost, we cannot afford to democratize extreme evil. Thanks.
Well, let me thank Bill for stretching our minds about technological developments. Let me remind you the ground rules here. There are microphones on the ground floor and on the second floor. If you'll line up at the microphone, identify yourself, make your statement as long as it's short or a question, and we'll be open for business, starting here.
Personally, I think you're absolutely right. Evolution stops for no...
Please identify yourself, because it's for the radio, yeah.
I'm a human, and I think we're going to be extinct soon. So, okay. Personally, no, I just want to ask you how I think this is inevitable. And even with the different ways that you are describing to try to block it here and block it there, evolution will find ways to get around it. Inevitably, I think we are screwed. How do you respond?
Well, I think Aristotle would have disagreed with you, because Aristotle said that the difference between us and the animals is we had reason. And so you're taking that Darwinian worldview that say we have to be subject to Darwin's laws, but I think the fact that we have reason distinguishes us from the animals, and we have the collective ability to use our reason to choose a different fate.
Please, you're on the right.
Alan Benjamin, unaffiliated. In your article, I'm curious, and I liked it a lot. It was very controversial, but I wanted to ask you why you had to describe in a fairly detailed biographically what your 20 years, what you had been doing. I mean, I looked upon that and I thought, if this had been a liberal journal or a conservative journal and someone had been writing that, you wouldn't necessarily have the author describe the credentials, quote unquote, the liberal credentials or a conservative credentials, and I was wondering why you had to do that. And secondly, what responsibility do you share when you made that quote about your 20 years of experience, and where do you see your involvement as far as your critical evaluation of of the evolving problems that we face for the 21st century.
I put the autobiographical stuff in because the editor-in-chief of the magazine, who was the editor of the piece, insisted that I do that. And I think the evaluations, when that was the correct thing to do, it helped a lot of people to understand the perspective, but it wasn't, you know, it was asked for. Okay. I think that I certainly have accelerated the development of this technology in my own work, which has certainly accelerated our nearness to the danger. I've certainly helped push Moore's Law along in some of the work that I've done by creating some of the arms race that's been going on in our industry, pushing Intel to make faster and faster microprocessors. In my own work, I'm only working on what I consider to be defensive technologies, namely more reliable computer systems, because I think reliability is something defense needs. Offense can just use overwhelming force. And that's the way I'm justifying to myself the continued work that I'm doing, but I may discover that that argument doesn't hold water. If so, I'll have to just stop.
Thank you.
Good. Here in the balcony.
My name's Alex. First of all, just thank you for bringing some of this stuff into a greater public debate. It's very rare that stuff like this happens before it's actually released. So the economic system in which we're living here, or some would say dying here, you know, it's the nature of it is that it has to grow in order to survive. And people like you speaking about multi-trillion-dollar growth, I mean, it's making a lot of people, you know, just salivate very, you know. But people who are opposed to it, some of the stuff you're talking about is extremely, you know, it's a big problem. You know, people are pretty worried. So, without any public debate, you know, and these technologies being released into the public, obviously we're going to have a lot of backlash from people. Like genetic engineering, for example, you know, there's no public debate, right? And the stuff is in the food chain now. Dioxin, for example, it's in the living tissue of every living being on the planet, you know.
Well, you know, I think that we can conceive systems that aren't based on growth. People would call them in general post-scarcity societies. And people have thought about it, and people have thought about, you know, the ethical issues of that, and even the ethical issues of immortality. You can go back to books written in the 60s. And so we can imagine a situation where there'd be sufficient wealth in the world that there wouldn't be scarcity. And I wrote a white paper for the Aspen Institute along that line. I think we, in fact, don't even need these new technologies to achieve that. We need the political will to spread the wealth around a little more, to raise everyone out of material poverty. I think that's within our grasp, even without these new technologies. We need some of the new technologies as well, though, to develop remedies for some of the emerging diseases, clearly. So we have to strike a balance. But we can't imagine a society without unbounded growth. Clearly, we can't continue to use more energy forever. Well, eventually, we'll burn the planet up with the heat we use. So there's a limit, ultimately, to the amount of just watts that we can use.
Over here in the left balcony, please.
Thank you. My name is Josh. I'm a student here. Now, I understand, and it's very easy to say that technology is getting out of control. And in fact, it's very easy to prove that with what's going on. And I can see why that would lead to problems. But I do not see why that could lead people, optimists no less, to predict a 50% chance of extinction. Now, I'd like to ask you how this is practical, if you can somehow answer this. When you see me up here, I'm living now. I'll be living for the next few years, I think. And I'm curious, if there's a 50% chance of extinction, how exactly would I be in the 50% that dies? Is a little microchip going to come waddling into my room at night and smite me somehow? Or how exactly is this going to happen? To me, I'm talking on the individual level. What is going to kill us?
The nearest term threat is a plague that's almost 100% fatal. Okay. Probably a derivative of influenza genetically engineered with something else.
Hi, my name is Savan, and I'm actually a researcher at Brandeis University in evolutionary computation. And some of my work, though not my core research, some of it has involved evolutionary robotics. And this is, you know, all part of the overall AI paradigm that's been with us for, like, I don't know, 50 years. And I'm a bit surprised that all of a sudden there's this concern, because for decades AI has been viewed as a big flop. That it's been promised to be just, you know, around the corner, and hasn't come, and it's still not here. And personally, I still don't see it coming. sure, the computer power is growing at an incredibly fast rate, and you mentioned something about being equivalent to the raw computing power of the brain, but the power is not what is important, it's the organization that's important, and we have no clue about that. We really don't. And as far as the evolutionary techniques go, I mean, they're evolutionary in metaphor only, really. I mean, they're inspired by these things, and we really don't know how these things work. And so I feel like this has been caught up in hype. I mean, I do personally have a lot of concerns, and I'm glad you're bringing these up. I mean, someone mentioned genetically modified foods. I'm very concerned about that because I could eat it now, and I'm concerned about how corporations are using this technology. And I appreciate your desire to introduce ethical debate into the creation of new technologies. But when it comes to that, I mean, it seems to me that knowing how far off AI really is, I mean, I think my grandchildren aren't even going to be around to see that happen. It seems to me that to use up our limited resources to worry about that, as opposed to some of the other things that you mentioned, or guns, or poverty, just seems to be a little bit misplaced. But overall, I mean, I do appreciate the fact that you are concerned about these things. I just wanted to make a comment.
I think Ray Kurzweil's answer to your, I'll give Ray answer to your question, which is that what's happening is time is not a constant anymore, that we're making progress at an accelerating rate. So if you took the rate of progress you see today and assumed that was going to be the rate of progress in the 21st century, then yes, maybe it wouldn't happen in the 21st century. But in fact, the rate of progress is accelerating so that we're going to get like 20,000 years worth of progress in a century because of these incredible exponential forces coming together. But both Ray and Hans Moravec, I think, make strong cases that, you know, the raw computing power will roughly be there. And I think with the work of Rod Brooks and others that we can see how we can imagine intelligent systems being created bottoms up. Like there's a really great checker program that was just learn to play checkers by playing checkers. So it's not clear to me that intelligence won't be an emergent property when these systems get to be powerful enough. So.
Back on this side?
I'm Beardsley Rummel. I take it, I'm persuaded that the dangers that you describe are there and much greater than ever. But I'm also struck by the analogy with the First Amendment. It's clear that there is a lot of speech that does no one any good. But the First Amendment seems to me based on the theory that, in fact, it's impossible to find somebody to make the decisions about who may speak and who will be prohibited from speaking. How are we to decide what mechanism will we use to decide which technologies to pursue and which may not be pursued?
Well, that's the point, is if the moral equivalent of a submachine gun is some bits in the computer, how do we prevent people from passing it, and if we consider it speech? So that's my point, is we've made these distinctions because these things had materiality, that we could say you can't possess this material. But when everything becomes immaterial, essentially, the way the court's looking at it now, speech, we no longer can make this discrimination, which we will need to be able to make. So that's that. We're going to have to fire in a theater and learn it hand and all that. When we do make this distinction, in fact, we'll have to make it more precisely than we have in the past.
Who will make that distinction?
Well, we'll have to reset our social contract to do this. We may have to amend the Constitution to say, you know, speech is allowed except computer software passed around that's a bomb is not considered speech if the courts choose to, you know.
Well, I don't think that's a problem.
But we may have to amend the Constitution to do that because the courts may choose not to interpret it that way. You know, it depends on the court, right? So it may not be acceptable. The outcome may not be acceptable, and that's the point I'm trying to make.
So your who would be whoever's now making the equivalent decision. So please.
I'm Ben Vagoda. My colleagues here and I are working on self-assembling nanoscale scaffolding toward our work as a PhD candidates at MIT. And I was wondering, as we head out into our careers, what role you think we should have in influencing these decisions and making them for ourselves?
Well, I think if you could participate in the kind of call that Hans Bethe had to sign a pledge of, not using these technologies destructively, think through the implications, and try to encourage the people you come into contact to think ethically about the uses of these technologies. That's very, very important. If you decide something that you're doing is so dangerous it fell into the wrong hands, someone could use it very destructively, I think you should probably not do that. And I think we don't have enough examples of people not doing that. We need more examples, and being a shining example isn't a bad thing. There's lots of other ways to spend your time.
Here on the left balcony.
Patrick Feng, I'm a graduate student. First, just to follow up on the last questioner, an example prototype of a Hippocratic oath might be Student Pugwash, that is an organization that encourages scientists and engineers to kind of take an oath that says, I will use my knowledge for good, and that's probably not a bad place to start from. My question for you was that you pointed out this kind of, the danger of democratizing what you call, banal evil, and I agree that, putting designer pathogens in everyone's hands is probably a bad idea. But I was wondering about whether democracy is really the kind of word you're looking for there, because I can imagine that democratization of knowledge in some other sense might be good. I mean, what I see now is that the problem is that we have this great speed, and that all of the incentives in our political economic systems is for entrepreneurs and scientists to get their stuff out there first, to patent it, to get market share. And this has to be done very quickly. Whereas if you had a democratic process of knowledge construction, you might say, well, whoa, you can't file for patents until some ordinary citizens look at this, or until we have some time to think about this. Right. So maybe in that sense, you might think of some processes to actually slow down the process, and maybe democracy in that sense is what you're looking for.
Right. Certainly we have constitutionally, in principle, if not in practice, a democratic process for declaring war, which has slipped in recent years. And so in that sense, democracy would be good. But what you're talking about is having developed in science and technology, putting under the control of public policy, which is probably an anathema to most people. And it would have to work internationally to be effective. So I mean, it's an interesting Gedanken experiment to go down that path. You find something, please let me know. It seems a bit difficult. I would want to point out 7 things which work against control. And because I think we need to control these technologies. Moore's law, speeding everything up, makes it harder to control things. Self-replication makes it harder to control because it reduces the size of the act, which we have to discover and prevent. The irreversibility of most of these things. If we were Australians, we know all the stories about the rabbits in the outback. We don't have as much experience with irreversibility as some other people do, but that's different. The commercial nature makes it more difficult to control. The democratization. And then 2 I really didn't mention. One is that these new technologies really blur living versus machines. In other words, we can try to think of what we're doing to genetic things as though they were living things. We take a disease and make it into a designer disease. It's still kind of just biological. But our biological intuition breaks down because we've intervened in the natural world in a way that our rules of thumb don't hold anymore. And yet it's not also engineering. This is what's dangerous about genetic engineering. It's neither genetics nor engineering. It's this kind of xenotransplantation. And we're doing things that nature doesn't do. And so we run a risk of not understanding the consequence. My biggest concern with GM foods is ecological, not safety. And that's the area in which we understand far, far less. But the ultimate thing is I think our ability to foresee and thereby forestall, to use Schweitzer's term actually, is limited because these things are happening so quickly and we have this incredible consilience between the sciences going on that our ability to forecast what's going to happen is very limited. So all of these factors really pile onto us to make the control problem much more difficult, and we will have to come to some kind of control if we're not going to get to this end point of anybody can do anything. And then anything is possible, all science fiction is possible, if anybody can do anything they want.
Here on the left.
My name is Rodrigo Martinez. I'm a student here at Kennedy School. I think I agree with you in the sense that we need more discussion, but I would push a little bit further, and we need to hear different sides and both sides and different sides at the same time when we have a discussion. Following your argument, I think for the first time we also have tools to solve many of the development problems that we've had and we have even starker now than we had before. Think about poverty and the population and diseases, and we have tools now that will help us and are helping us attack some of these issues. And if we don't use them properly, that's the other direction of your argument. That might lead us to a even harder danger, which would be not using them appropriately. So I think having to hear both sides of the argument is important in bringing it up in discussion.
Yeah, I think I would love to see a panel with a philosopher, an ethicist, a poet, a religious leader, and a scientist talking about these things. If Aristotle were around, he could be 4 of those people, and we'd only need probably the religious leader, which speaks to the specialization, which is part of our problem. Well, that we really don't have, we haven't done enough looking across these historical disciplines. We need a wider discussion, not just involving scientists, and I think that's essential.
No, I agree, and some of us are doing that, and we are having those panels, and having, for example, E.O. Wilson talked to us 2 weeks ago. He said one of the ways to achieve certain care for the environment is exactly genetically modified foods, was exactly the opposite argument that you gave responding to the person before. So we're hearing different things from different people, which are recognized as, knowing, Wilson would probably be recognized as the...
There are a lot of people who believe genetically modified foods is the answer without knowing exactly what the question is. I call that jeopardy,
Unfortunately, Ed is not here tonight, but we'll ask him. Clear.
Yes, my name is Tom Castillo. I'm an undergraduate here. And in recent years, there's been a trend towards greater meshing of academia and industry. Like over at Stanford, their computer science programs are highly intertwined with business, and here there's more of a trend towards that. Do you think this has a positive or negative influence on some of the topics you've been speaking about?
I think the real talking we need is between philosophy, science, and ethics or religion, which are, if you look at the traditional way the universities were organized, science was a branch of philosophy, and the scientists don't talk to the philosophers and the ethicists enough, and I don't think we talk to the ethical tradition within our faith enough about our values and where we want to go with all this. I mean, I do not believe that just unlimited growth and economic growing forever is going to take us to where we want to go. I think we have a clear evidence that it's taking us somewhere we don't want to go. And if we're going to choose a different destination, we're not going to choose it based on the laws of physics, because the laws of physics don't provide any useful limits. So we have to bring ethical, spiritual, and values-based voices in to decide what we want to become. If we can make ourselves into anything, then we have to choose. And we haven't had to face that choice before. I think in this century we have to fully face that choice. It's a strange experience for us, because capitalism and the market aren't going to give us the answer that we necessarily want. They're going to give us some answer. It doesn't look like a very good one. It looks like a very risky answer. And it may not be something that's chosen democratically, even though it's the result of democracy. So there's some paradoxes for you there.
And then in an immediate sense, do you think it's safer to keep the industry out of academia, or that this perhaps has long-term positive effects?
I think any action you were going to take would have to necessarily involve all these existing institutions. That the time frame of the danger that I see, you're not going to imagine any sort of change. The nation states are going to go away, or industry is going to something, and none of that's going to happen within the time frame of interest. So you have to engage the institutions and organizations that we have today on the problem. You can't hope for new institutions to come along to save us. That would be foolish, I think.
Back up on the right balcony.
Hi, Saul Griffith from MIT. Your colleague Ray Kurzweil spoke there last week with the same caveat that he was an optimist. And I'm a little bit concerned about that as a sort of an introduction. It seems you're very optimistic about the technologies involved and very pessimistic about the social aspects of the technology. But my real question to you is, Moore's law was, I wonder if he would like to go down in the 20th century as the most quoted man. He really just stated a trend, and the unfortunate thing, it seems, is that Moore's law became Moore's dictum. It was really a focus for an entire industry to work towards in terms of their research goals. Unfortunately, we're now having equivalent things in the other fields that you talk about, equivalent to Moore's dictum. For example, a cover of a number of chemical engineering and chemical news articles now carry biotechnology, the solution to food problems and food scarcity in the 21st century. It really seems that we're creating these sort of economic reasons for developing these technologies to keep and it's a very American phenomenon, it would seem, also, to keep these industry accelerating. So do we really need to analyze those sort of economic causes and sort of scale down these grandiose laws, if you like?
Right. I'll add one person to my proposed panel of the philosopher and the poet and so on. It's a person with common sense. And it should always be the same person in my book. It's Amory Lovins, who's the ultimate example of common sense, who's pointed out that most of the systems we built are 99% inefficient. And so we can improve efficiency, and basically because they have no feedback in them. And systems without feedback are by definition dumb. In his book, you know, his book's Natural Capitalism, and factor 4, which has been adopted by some European economies, is factor 10. Just make a factor of 10 improvement in material efficiency and energy efficiency in a process. And why are we trucking the raw ingredients for yogurt all over Europe? It's the economic system is not providing the proper signals to do things in a resource-efficient way. So within his work, I think with existing technologies, we could materially improve the condition of everyone on the planet. If the alternative is for economic reasons to develop things that are extremely dangerous, then that's just in praise of folly. I mean, this is just some foolishness that we're going to do because our economic system doesn't provide us with the signals to get to a saner path. I mean, we need to improve the signals in the economy.
I think you go somewhere very interesting there, in that I think we're now having a lot of the debates that you're starting today, but they seem to be detracting us from the larger environmental debate that was started perhaps 5 years ago, but seems to be silent somewhat in the wake of these more pessimistic doomsday visions, which obviously get more press. How do we return? Should we not have more optimists really bringing up more Amory Lovins bringing up the optimistic environmental common sense solutions?
Well, I strongly recommend Amory's book. If you send me an email, I'll send you a free copy.
Here on the left.
Hi there. My name is Alex. I'm a sophomore at the college. When you talked about the possibilities of genetic scientists to be used for genocide, it reminded me of a small little article I saw, I think in the New York Times website a few months ago, which stated that the Israeli government, a democratically elected government, may be, and no one's sure about this, and they've vigorously denied it, of course, may be developing a biological weapon that is capable of being deployed within their own borders and targeting only people of Palestinian descent. That terrifies me, and it's inconceivable that that's possible, and yet, here we hear that it might be possible. Is that something that we're going to have to be worrying about in a few years, or is it? I'm scared.
Yeah, I'm not sure that if you listen to some of the traditional music of the two cultures, I'm not sure that genetic diversity is wide enough that would actually work. That would probably upset people. It's like revisionist Bible study, but technically, you could genetically engineer something on St. Patrick's Day, everybody who's Irish's face would turn green. I suppose those are all theoretically possible. There's lots of fun applications of these technologies. But, we don't have a lot of, these things tend to be hard to deploy. So, historically they were, at least. But that's not a prescription that they will be hard going forward. I think we should analyze it rationally. And it is of concern because clearly states can do bad things but our levers against states' bad behavior are much stronger than our levers against every individual who's crazy. So hopefully the people who know are trying to shut that down. It's happening.
Zach Exley, and unrestrained, unplanned growth that's the core religious belief in capitalism, and so that makes you a heretic in the Church of Capitalism, and that's really.
I'd rather be a heretic with common sense than a fool who wasn't a heretic.
Right. No, I'm excited about it, and it's great to hear somebody on the inside who's got a view about what's going on the inside and who's got some power maybe to be carrying out this act of heresy. And I'm wondering how many others like you are there on the inside, and are you, do you see the appropriate role for you to, and maybe the few others like you to play, to go on a campaign and convince the people who are running the show that we've got to rethink the system?
Well, I guess I don't believe anybody's running. I think the show is running itself, unfortunately. So there aren't a lot of people who, maybe I should make a list so people can sign it, but you know,
Which
and I was going to change my
door would you
login
nail
name
it
to Eeyore@sun.com, you know, so who else wants to be, you know, in charge of doom and gloom? You know, it's, Herman Kahn wrote a book, Thinking About the Unthinkable. I mean, these things aren't fun to talk about. People have to be willing. That's why I brought up what, you know, Edith Hamilton said about the Greeks. You know, I think our success or failure will be based on our willingness to talk about the things and address issues that are unpleasant and to challenge things that we've believed for a very long time. And I find the most support outside my own field, you know, almost a startling silence within computer science, even outside the sciences. In the humanities, I think if you find much more willingness because people haven't forgotten, you know, the ancients, you know. So the Aspen Institute has been very receptive, for example, because it's based on Mortimer Adler and Encyclopedia Britannica and the great books and all that, you know. And so you can find, it's all there. You just read the Greek tragedies. You don't have to, we don't need all this stuff that's happened since then. You can find all the descriptions of the problems and kind of some rough prescriptions for some things we shouldn't do, right? It's right there. You know, and Sophocles and all that. So you know, the science just is putting us in the same situation, I think, that they recognize in their own contemporary time. And we have to reconnect with that experience and do the kinds of wise things, I think, that they did in Athens, you know, 2,500 years ago.
Back here on the right.
My name is Mike Weissman. In his novels Snow Crash and The Diamond Age, the science fiction author Neil Stephenson paints pictures of some worlds which incorporate in a very fundamental sense the technologies you talked about tonight, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics. And those worlds are rather dystopian. I think a lot of people reading the books would agree. Now, I'm guessing you're familiar with those books that he's written, and I wonder if you would comment if you think we're going to stumble into those worlds in the coming decades, or if you think we have the collective wisdom to avoid the sorts of things that happen in the worlds he describes.
My view is that we can stumble into dystopian world or extinction. There's no grace that prevents us from extincting ourselves. Just look at the fossil record. You know, extinctions do happen. And Neil has read the piece. I've never met him. He sent an email into a forum that Wired magazine was running on the future, which pre-existed this article, and said, you know, yeah, you know, the piece affected me too. I'm not going to try to reproduce his words, but you know, he enjoyed the piece and had some thoughtful things to say. So I don't think his books preempt. These things are complementary, probably. I hope he writes another book, you know, perhaps even more tied to more likely scenarios than those books were. Unfortunately, Larry Niven once wrote these books about, was it Tila Brown, who was infinitely lucky, this woman who was genetically selected for luck, so nothing bad could ever happen to her. And after a while, he stopped writing about it because it's so boring. You know, nothing ever happens. And the same thing, you know, books that are the end. I mean, then what? You know, it's like there's not a lot of room for a sequel. So I mean, you can do flashbacks, but you know, books about bad outcomes. We don't make American movies like that. You know, Kurt Vonnegut's classical graph of, you know, American movies, Indian movies maybe, but American movies always have this happy ending, the hero and the backstory and the whole three-part thing. This is not a typical kind of a story. So we don't tend to enjoy going to see movies that have this kind of a theme. I guess 12 Monkeys did, for example. That's the closest equivalent I've seen to a filmed version of Frank Herbert's novel, The White Plague, which is the closest fictional treatment of the problem that we face, I think. Although he didn't really anticipate the information age, but he has a molecular biologist doing something bad as a terrorist act in his book.
Up here on the balcony.
Hi, Yale McGuire from MIT. I'm also somebody who works pretty intimately with these technologies, and I think in general we have to be careful about what we think goes on exponential curves like Moore's law. It's sort of what separates optimists from pessimists is what goes on and what doesn't go on. And I've heard a lot of optimists say that in response to the argument that you're making, that the tools to combat a lot of the problems could also follow exponential growth to match that, and wanted to know what you thought about that.
The problem I see with that, and this is a proposition that ought to be examined more carefully by people in the various disciplines, is that there's an asymmetry with these technologies between offense and defense. The destructive uses have all the advantage. In other words, I can take a very fast computer and just explore holes in the immune system. It's much easier to find a hole than to develop a therapy. It's much easier to have a destructive use than a constructive one. And it's very, very hard to plug all the holes. It's almost inconceivable. The amount of engineering we'd have to do on our own genome to make an immune system which didn't have any viruses that could attack it is almost inconceivable. So I think this, unless someone can prove that there's not this asymmetry that, like with nuclear, offense has the advantage, then as we create these technologies, we only increase the danger because the defense is at a disadvantage in protecting against an arbitrary pathogen created with these technologies. How do we defend against the robots going out of control? I mean, we can put the laws in, but how do we prevent them from mutating? If they're inherently so powerful that if they mutate, they can get us, then we've put ourselves in a dangerous, we're only one accident away from a very dangerous situation. So I wish I wish this wasn't true. I wish it wasn't the case that offense appeared to have such a strong advantage over defense, but it certainly appears to be the case.
Left margin?
Hello, I'm Fleming Ray. I'm a graduate student at MIT in Chemical Engineering and Technology and Policy. Thank you for your comments. What you're describing sounds sort of like a problem of the commons. So I was wondering if you had thought more in detail about organizations that might be first movers to address this?
Yeah, in fact, I have spoken in a 6-week period. I've come here to the group that's worked on these issues at the Kennedy School. I've talked with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for Advancement of Science, I've got a talk coming up with the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. I'm talking tomorrow at NSF and DARPA, and I'm going to the National Research Council in Canada in May. Is this May? Yes, it's May already. Okay. So those are the obvious, and in a public forum at Stanford University. And my goal, I think, the one thing I would say is when we dealt with things like pugwash, I'm afraid that we were a little narrow and we looked within science for the solutions. I don't think the solutions are within science, quite frankly. I'm willing to look. I'm not opposed to solutions within science. That would be wonderful. But we have to involve a broader spectrum of people if we're going to not preclude. And if you look back just in Nature or Science magazine this last week, people talked about the 75-76 moratorium, the famous Asilomar moratorium on recombinant DNA. And they explicitly, as part of, they said, being able to have the seminar precluded any discussion of the ethics. They only talked about safety or something. Well, that, to me, is not a tenable approach to take. So I don't think drawing from that we can say that's the approach we should take now, because I think we'll define the problem narrowly and just conclude there's no answer. And in fact, the answer is probably in where are we trying to go? How much is enough? Can we find other ways, whatever some unrestricted form of nanotechnology was going to do for us, can we find some other technology that's not so dangerous that'll do 95% of it? And just say we won't do that. And somehow we have to collectively decide that it's not just an arms race to create a NASDAQ index of 1 trillion, but to keep some semblance of safety on the planet. We don't want to create all these externalities as risks, and we have to find some probably non-governmental collective mechanism for making that kind of a choice. We haven't had to do that before. I admit that that's really difficult. I don't see any alternatives. So I understand that it's going to be hard to pull off. But unless we can find solutions within science, we're going to have to find public policy, ethical, other solutions to lowering some of these risks.
Have you found any resonance in the business community, either at Sun or elsewhere, with your concerns?
The best resonance I got was actually from Jim Clark, who's the founder of Netscape and Healthion. He's a serial entrepreneur. He sent me an email. He said, I don't agree with everything you say. I don't understand everything, and I don't agree with it all, the parts I do understand, but how can I help? Okay, and that's the right attitude. I think this is an open mind. It's like, this seems like a worthwhile discussion to have. Let's participate. And I would say I've gotten that from some people, some of the more people involved in the environmental movement, EcoNet, PeaceNet, Social Venture Network, Threshold Foundation, these kinds of socially responsible, Ben & Jerry's kinds of people, have responded, which you'd expect. But in the mainstream of the business community, the Fortune 500, Davos, which I went to last year, I think Klaus Schwab wants to have this as a subject of discussion at the next Davos, which I will find very interesting. We'll see what the business community, it affects their children too. So, you can always wave the, children in the air. So, it's a standard trick here, but it really does. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens at the next Davos, but that's not for a while.
Thank you.
Please.
I'm an alumnus, and my usual interest is the ocean. You mentioned briefly Star Wars, and I believe it creates a foreign policy problem in that right now the US protects Europe through NATO. When you get into Star Wars, there is no way it will involve Europe, and so there will be a separation which doesn't exist today. Am I correct?
Well, I'm not sure the missile defense system actually works. What, it shot down one, it intercepted one? Or did they just do enough tests till it shot down one and say, stop, now we have one example, so now it works? I'm not sure it works. If it did work, you're quite right. I mean, the decoupling of our dependence would create a strategic instability. It's not my field, but I think there's certainly some truth to that statement.
My name is Carolyn Ringel, and so a friend was talking to me today, and we were talking about this thing that's being developed, and it's not really a chip, but it's sort of like a chip, and it can be used to replace damaged parts of the brain, and it's not just electric impulses. It actually can learn and develop and become, in effect, a replacement part of the brain, and so it has amazing implications for things like, any brain disease, Alzheimer's, whatever. But what I'm curious about is, given the concerns that you've outlined, is this sort of development something that's exciting and wonderful because it can, advance humans, or do you see it as sort of an illusory benefit for humans because it's really one step in the extinction because of the convergence of humans and machine?
It's this kind of Pied Piper situation where we have a sequence of individual advances, each of which is beneficial, yet the consequence of all of them is bad. And so we have to stop. If we're going to stop, and we have to stop at some point, we're going to have to relinquish the next step, which would be beneficial for the sake of leaving some distance between us and the disaster. Kevin Warwick, who is the researcher who implanted a chip in his body, he was on the cover of Wired magazine also. They had a holographic thing showing that his arm with and without the chip. In fact, created a petition that he's trying to get people to sign saying we need international controls over the development of robotics because of his concerns about these things. So there are certainly people within that community. I think if you read Kurzweil and Moravec's book, I mean, I don't know how you can fail to view these as cautionary tales, especially Moravec's book, which is an incredibly dystopian view of the robots. He in fact says, and you can find it on the web, the robots are going to take over, we're extinct, forget about it, it's done. I mean, I think he's gone over the edge when he says that, but and he's an expert in the field, believes that the forces are so strong. If that's true, we better, I'm not that fatalist, we better think about how far we're willing to go. And there may be some things that we can't do for the sake of an individual to better the population. We already do that with vaccination. We insist that kids in school be vaccinated. For me, the best situation is I not be vaccinated and everyone else is, because then I don't take the risk of an adverse reaction to the vaccine, but I don't have any risk of infection because everyone else is vaccinated, right? So we clearly make a trade-off when we get vaccinated. We take some individual risk for the sake of everybody. And most of us just aren't aware or don't even think about it, right? We don't add it up in that way. But so we do already have examples of this where we have to make these kinds of trade-offs.
Here in the balcony.
Yeah, my name is Susan Humans. I'm on the steering committee of the Episcopal Church Working Group on Science, Technology, and Faith. And you may know, or you are likely to know in the future, that there's going to be a session on the ethics of nanotechnology at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco next February. And this same working group is doing a similar thing about genetics enhancement and food security even earlier in 2001. So I think it's a positive challenge to the faith communities to get asked to think about what they can add to this, which is different from what secular reasoning might add. There's one other comment I'd like to make. As we've looked at a variety of environmental health and ethical dilemmas where lay people struggle with science, ostensibly on science issues, if you analyze each of those, there are an awful lot of presenting problems that come from the regulatory structure and from the economic driver of whatever the technology is. And it seems to me that involving citizens as well as policymakers in understanding those ways that the science is made harmful would be a way to get alliance to deal with these ethical issues across issues where now people are so short-sighted about the structure of their problem that they don't see these common economic driver, regulatory, financing of research at universities and so forth, those kinds of trends.
Right. Well, I'm actually going to Grace Cathedral soon to talk about what we talked about here today. I think within the next month or 6 weeks. Actually it's this month. This is May. I was on Charlie Rose talking about this, and the pastor of my church, I'm a lapsed churchgoer, sent me a mail, and so I sent it back. Oh, I have a question. I said, God allows suffering in the world. Does this mean that would in our faith, that I was brought up in, would He save us from ourselves? That was a very serious question. He did research and sent me an answer. And I've been talking to friends who are Jewish, and I'm actually trying to see Zalman, who's a Jewish Reform, who's a very liberal thinker within that faith, to talk to him about, I think if we look within each of the faiths, what we'll find is the faiths largely arose as part of the challenge of us going into the cities and trying to live more closely with each other, because we needed some rules like the 10 Commandments. As long as we were small tribes, we didn't really need that. And it's hard for me to imagine that in any faith which works in a sustainable way in that kind of close proximity wouldn't have a notion of personal responsibility. So the more I look, I find the same. And so in some sense, the ethical traditions within the faiths are strongly supportive of us taking responsible action. If I find a major world religion that doesn't have this, I will be very surprised. I don't know them well enough. It's an interesting opportunity to go learn more about, say, Hinduism. I'm not going to learn Sanskrit and read the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit like Oppenheimer did. I don't have that talent for languages, but we can certainly go talk to people in these different faiths. And certainly in California, they're close at hand, as they're all working in the companies in Silicon Valley, and ask them these questions, because they are important. They are important questions, and answers that are supported through these existing institutions will find it'll be much easier to affect change. People like Billy Graham are still a very strong voice for responsible action on these kinds of issues.
And another piece of perspective that they'll probably bring is that you're not expected to 100% solve problems. That well, this gets back to some of your Greek tragedy stuff. Once we try to have 100% answers,
right,
we're outside of what faith expects people to do.
Right. I don't expect us to be able to make the risk go away, but I think we should take responsible steps to choose paths that are less dangerous, and things that are just so dangerous that the numbers get to be untenable. We should. Sanity would suggest that we should stop. So maybe we can have a vote. I don't know. It can be just a straw poll or something. At some point. That the purpose of democracy.
Can I add one?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
We have time for 2 last questions, and we'll take this gentleman and this lady, and then unfortunately we're going to have to stop. Please.
Hi, thanks a lot for your time. I'm Paul Nitz. I'm a senior at the college, and I've had a chance to hear what you have to say at the Aspen Institute a few times. I'm curious as to what you said about Aristotle and the pursuit of ultimately of happiness and the need to use other means to achieve what is the ultimate end in happiness. It seems that in terms of human beings' material happiness, that the course of civilization has really gone towards it's been a constant struggle towards the elimination of things like disease and generally the quest for longevity in our lifespan. And one of the biggest problems, it seems, in combating some of the driving forces behind technology is that ultimately it's going to be virtually impossible to stay this desire that people are going to have, not only for the elimination of disease, which brings sort of the problem of having remedies that are so good that ultimately it's only the plague that wipes it out, but also the problem of longevity, which pushes constantly towards immortality and towards what you've suggested and what other people have suggested in terms of the fusion between human beings and robots. Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of drive which seems so innately human and so utterly difficult to control.
Well, George Dyson, who has become a friend, and said, and he wrote this great book about the relationship of people to machines, said probably the sensible way to achieve immortality is through your children. I wrote a paper for the Aspen Institute about this issue of material poverty and just the word poverty in general. And I don't think it's only material poverty that we have to alleviate. There's another definition that Edith Hamilton attributed to the Greeks, which is happiness is the exercise of vital forces along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope. It's kind of like, the flow in the modern terms, or, personal best. People have to have some challenge in their life. They have to have some meaning. Simply giving them enough material things to survive, I don't think is going to, arrest poverty in the sense of poverty being the possibility for, the absence of poverty is the opportunity for happiness. So I think we should strive, we can argue about what the definition of happiness should be, but I would submit that that is the closest definition. That seems to, I think, can be almost acceptable in East and West. That's a good first cut, in my view, definition of what we should be striving to achieve for the majority of people on the planet.
But even as we accept, just quickly, even as we accept the ethos of no pain, no gain, it seems that the evolution has been towards a constant alleviation of pain, or that's been the goal.
Well, in some sense, thinking people could argue that we intervene too much at the end of life in the death process to sustain, economically and probably even to the detriment of the dignity of people dying. So there's limits to what we should probably do to intervene in some of these things.
Last question, please.
My name is Sally Whalen. I think what's troubled me the most is the lack of public discourse on any of these developments, any wide public discourse. And those discussions that I've heard, I've noticed that when people from other disciplines raise objections or concerns, they're often labeled Luddites. And I guess I'm wondering how likely you think it is that people from within the field are going to get over this kind of arrogance and really recognize that there are disciplines that have been working for generations and centuries with issues of social policy, with the world's religions, with the human soul and its desires, that there will be a recognition that we need wisdom even more than knowledge right now at this juncture.
Right. Well, and in fact, I was taken to task by some letters to the editor, which I encouraged Wired to reprint in the next issue of responses to the article, that I was really unfair to the Luddites. But in some sense, our vocabulary is unfair to them. And it's become a word that means knee-jerk anti-technology, when in fact it was a social movement that was concerned about the social impacts of machines. And there was certainly some violence by, well, what appears to have been violence by some of the Luddites in smashing property, and we had a different regime of property at the time and all that in debtor's prison. It was a different system. It's not clear that those incidents weren't manufactured by the state as an excuse for crushing the Luddite movement. But the movement was not as ill-conceived as our modern description of it would have. So, but it's such a pejorative at this point. It's something that if you become branded with it, it's a very destructive thing. So I went to pains to say that I'm not a Luddite in that sense. I believe responsible use of technology is important. Clearly agricultural technology, if we were all hunter-gatherers, most of us wouldn't be here and we'd have died already. So, but we have to be rational and bring science back together with philosophy, ethics, and with the faith to really, I think, address this danger that we face. I don't see any alternative. We have to deinstitutionalize the academy and bring things cross-disciplinary together, because it's only in the crossing that we'll find, I think, the ability to address these issues.
And I think it's in the labeling sometimes when that label is used conveniently to shut off the public discourse.
And there's a famous story about, was it Sophocles was going in, they were going to declare him incompetent, and this story about how he recited the court a poem from his Nick's play to prove his sanity. You know, that a poem could be a proof of anything in our society. And we've lost touch with the arts as having the same value as the sciences. And I think that is one of the things that puts us in danger. We have to kind of bring these pieces back together to make kind of wise choices.
So let me, on behalf of the Harvard crowd, say thank you to Bill for a very courageous article. Those of you who didn't read yet the piece in Wired, it's a very, very good read, and it's not going to be the end of this conversation. Bill Joy has done, I think, a great service to us all in pushing these issues up on the agenda as a subject for debate without presuming to know the answers, but simply to say, from the middle of the process, as I see it, here's some problems, and we should be talking about them and thinking about them and considering what's appropriate to do. What better a place to be part of the discussion and debate, so we thank him very much for coming here, and hope he comes back.
Oh, hi, how are you? I came here, you're talking about failure. Oh, no. I don't know much about audio. I do know